I really want to get into Somalia because I feel like it's just such a dark hole. Like for me, it's very 1984, which is that it's just very dystopian that we've had like one of the longest, and I think it is now the longest running war in American history. And basically, no one that I ever talk to knows it's even happening. And there's not really much media coverage. Many things, my only source for what's going on there is literally you from going straight to AFRICOM themselves. So I wanted you to kind of start with, well, first I would go with your introduction. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and then why you care so much about Somalia to be surfing the AFRICOM website, and then kind of how did we get here in the first place, if that makes any sense.
So, I mean, I care about Somalia because it's my job, because I work for antiwar.com. I'm the news editor there. So I cover U.S. foreign policy and U.S. wars and interventions. And this is something that's going on that just gets no attention. And that's actually kind of what brought me to working for antiwar.com. I first started writing for them, submitting articles to them back in 2018 and 2019 about the U.S. war, or the Saudi war in Yemen that was backed by the U.S. that also got virtually no attention in the media. And it was a really brutal, horrific war. And I just remember thinking, like, how come nobody's talking about this? How come this isn't a scandal at all that Trump is supporting this? One of the reasons for that is the fact that it started under Obama. So it was a Democrat, supported war as well. But I mean, there was horrific atrocities going on there. So that's how I started writing for antiwar.com. And then in 2020, I started full time as the news editor. And again, a part of my job is just following the airstrikes, like where the U.S. is launching bombs and stuff, is dropping bombs and stuff. So Somalia is one that, again, it just gets no attention. And I mean, a big part of the coverage that I do and kind of the way I write the articles is to draw attention to like the unprecedented number of airstrikes that the U.S. has launched there this year. And like, I think it's kind of sad. Like, it kind of says a lot about the state of our country that we can be waging a war like this and just nobody is aware of it. Like, I would be curious what a poll shows. Like, if Americans were polled to ask if they know that, the U.S. is currently waging a war in Somalia, how many people would know? So, yeah, and so that's why I'm currently covering it, because it's my job. And the reason why it's my job is because, the reason why I do this for a living is because I think, war is such an important issue that often gets ignored. And, I said I do it for a living. I don't make a great living doing it. There's not much money in the anti-war business, believe it or not, but
we know.
A lot more money if you switch sides.
But I am very blessed, with my situation. I had a good job beforehand, and, my family and I are doing all right. But just, it is what I do. So that's why, it's other people's job too. Other American journalists, it's their job to cover it too, and they're failing at that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, me and Shael were just having a nice little DM back and forth of all the different, journalists that we think are the best for actually doing their jobs and covering a lot of these things. So why is it that there doesn't seem to be much media outside of talking to AFRICOM themselves? Like, is there nobody really covering on the ground there?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the difficult thing, is that it's tough to really know what's happening on the ground. And a lot of my coverage of it is just based on what AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command, is saying. And they don't say much, believe it or not. And, there's Somali media that I follow, but it's tough. Again, there's really not much coverage about like the scene of a U.S. airstrike, like what actually is happening on the ground. And I know in the areas controlled by Al-Shabaab, they crack down on internet. They restrict the use of the internet. And I know the U.S.-backed government has also, they've thrown journalists in jail who have covered the war in a critical way. So it's just really tough to know. But the fact that, there's no oversight, and we know from history what U.S. drone strikes, U.S. drone warfare is like. There's been some incidents recently where it looks like the U.S. killed a civilian, but for the most part, it's really tough to get that information and to really know what's going on.
So how did we actually get here? I know we had the overthrow of the communist dictator in Somalia, and then that's what's descended into this warring warlords. But like, what exactly kind of put us in this situation to where it's such a concern, at least for the U.S. government?
Yeah, and Shael, good to meet you.
Very good to meet you, Dave. I'm a big fan.
I follow you on X. You're a good follow. I appreciate your point of view and speaking out and everything.
I was introduced to you by Daniel, and since he introduced me to you, I've been a big fan. So I was
Hey,
very, very happy to see that we got you.
Nice. That's great to hear. Thanks. So yeah, how did we get here in Somalia? So you mentioned the overthrow of the communist dictator who was actually backed by the U.S. during the Cold War. He kind of shifted sides from the Soviet Union to the U.S. And everybody knows about what Americans call Black Hawk Down, or the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993. And essentially what that was a UN humanitarian mission that went very wrong. It involved U.S. attacks that, they're trying to bring food, and warlords were stealing aid and stuff. And then the U.S. started trying to capture certain people and killed civilians. And then there was all this outrage. And then the Battle of Mogadishu happened, and some Americans were killed. The American mind usually doesn't think about the context of what exactly happened, of the U.S. killing civilians before that whole mess happened. But anyway, so Somalia was very unstable. And after 9/11, the war on terror started, and the U.S. got involved in Somalia. They started backing the same warlords that they fought in the early 90s, basically. And in 2006, a group called the Islamic Courts Union, which was a coalition of different Muslim groups, took power in Mogadishu. They threw out the CIA-backed warlords, and the U.S. wasn't happy about that, and they backed an Ethiopian invasion to take out the Islamic Courts Union. And now, looking back, I was looking back recently, like, what were the allegations? Like, why did the U.S. support overthrowing this new government, a very decentralized government, but it seemed to bring stability to Mogadishu? And the claim was that they were harboring like 3 al-Qaeda guys, and there was just no evidence for it. There was evidence that they were hiding out in Somalia, but no connection to the ICU. But anyway, the U.S. backed the overthrow of that government. So that was 2006. And then in 2007, a group called Al-Shabaab, which was kind of the radical offshoot of the Islamic Courts Union, started attacking Ethiopian troops occupying Mogadishu. Their first attack was a suicide bombing against Ethiopians. And now we've been fighting them in a war ever since, basically, and kind of propping up this government based in Mogadishu, which relies on support from the U.S., the African Union, and the EU. And it's kind of, one of these endless wars that just goes on. And it's in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to U.S. wars, it's like a relatively low-level conflict, but not this year. I mean, things have really ramped up. And there's also an ISIS affiliate now that's an offshoot of Al-Shabaab. And this is a pattern that you see in these wars. Like in Afghanistan, the U.S. is fighting the Taliban for years and years, and then an ISIS affiliate pops up, and then they also have to bomb them, and it's just a mess. So that's where we're at now. And this year, there was actually a meeting, according to the New York Times, within the Trump administration at the White House, and State Department officials suggested that the U.S. should basically cut and run because Al-Shabaab was making a lot of progress, and they were threatening Mogadishu. And the discussions were, the U.S. was considering closing the embassy down because they didn't want a repeat of what happened in Kabul in Afghanistan. That's like how much of the threat of Mogadishu falling was. But instead of doing that, they've doubled down on the airstrikes. And, counterterrorism experts, people that know about Somalia, Al-Shabaab has conducted some horrific terrorist attacks in other countries in Africa. But the common thread is that they target countries that are involved in the African Union mission. And this idea that they have like global ambitions is just not true. So, you have counterterrorism experts who say the Somali government's just got to make some kind of deal with Al-Shabaab because they're never going to win this war. Yet the U.S., they just keep the war going. So yeah, that's where we're at today.
I've heard from at least a couple of different sources on the history that the or the Al-Shabaab people, they were like a very small minority of the ICU when it came in, and they were kind of like looked at as the crazies, the young crazies. Those were the exuberant youngsters. And what seems to have happened from the Ethiopian invasion is it's turned them into war heroes and legitimized them as, hey, we actually do have to be violent. We actually do have to lean into some of these things. And I'm wondering if you know how accurate that is, if it's kind of played like an insurgent math game in Somalia, these airstrikes.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure in some cases they have. That's the thing, we were discussing before. It's tough to right now. I mean, there's just no media coverage of this. I am literally the only person in like American media that writes articles. I was going to say print media, but we don't have like a newspaper. But like I write stories, to cover this. In the US, like nobody else is doing that. Like there's no media coverage. So when there's no oversight for the Pentagon, like that, they usually do bad things. So I know in
And when
September,
your only source is the government that's doing it.
yeah. And then some stuff that comes from Somalia. I know in September, the US bombed a clan leader in northern Somalia who, according to, really outraged the locals. So that story came out. The US claimed he was an Al-Shabaab weapons dealer, but the his family and locals all rejected that and said he was a peacemaker. And, there's questions there because apparently he clashed with the Puntland government of who did the U.S. get the intelligence from? Are they handing the U.S. to say, target this guy, claiming he's Al-Shabaab when they're just kind of someone that they want to get rid of? I think that's a possibility. But yeah, when it comes about, I mean, you always see that, with these conflicts. If the U.S. bombs a village and they kill civilians, the people there, they're going to side with the people fighting against them. That's generally what happens. And I know that there's all different clans in Somalia and the view is from the rural clans that live outside of the cities is that, the government in Mogadishu is like a foreign-backed, propped-up government. Some of them have helped in the fight against Al-Shabaab. A lot of them have stopped doing that in recent years because they're not happy with things the president has been doing. So there's so many different factions on the ground. But yeah, I mean, when you bomb villages and you kill civilians, these things are going to happen. And the U.S. just doesn't have, a presence on the ground. Not that that would help, but the U.S. doesn't have any significant presence on the ground either. There's about, I think, 500 U.S. troops, special forces, and they send the National Guard there, which is crazy. But yeah, I think, and as you mentioned that they were kind of the radicals, the young, that's how I understand them too, that they were kind of the smaller, more radical faction of the Islamic Courts Union.
So are there genuine political grievances that are behind what Al-Shabaab is doing? Or is this just, as it's portrayed in the West, a jihadist insurrection? How do the two intersect?
Yeah, well, I think it's clear from the context that we just discussed that, this is Al-Shabaab was clearly a reaction to a foreign occupation. And they declared themselves aligned with Al-Qaeda in 2012. Whenever you see the AFRICOM press releases or people in the U.S. talk about it and they say, oh, they're one of the biggest Al-Qaeda affiliates in the world. I believe they have about 10,000 fighters is the estimate. But it's clear like why this conflict is happening, what they're fighting against. I mean, again, they've carried out horrific attacks, suicide bombings and stuff. And when you look at the ones that have happened outside of Somalia, it's always targeting countries that have fought against them. So it's clear that is like it's a localized conflict.
Is there anyone to negotiate with? So I was reading some of your stuff, and you're absolutely correct that the use of force seems counterproductive. But how real are the alternatives? What are the alternatives? Is there anyone to talk to? Is there any real political solution available?
Yeah. So, I'm not an expert on this, on Somalia, on, the different factions on Al-Shabaab, but I know like relatively mainstream sources and people who follow this and are considered counterterrorism experts, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism, who recently visited Somalia, have said that they should negotiate with Al-Shabaab, that the government should negotiate with Al-Shabaab. And I know their leader, who was killed in, I think, 2013, since he was killed, they consider Al-Shabaab to be less kind of radical and more concerned about what's happening in southern and central Somalia where they are based. So I guess, that is a potential alternative is negotiations, which is how everything ultimately ends usually. I mean, even in Afghanistan, obviously that didn't go too well at the end there, but it is an option.
And is the Trump administration pursuing anything, as far as you know, aside from military means? Or is it just military means that it's pursuing?
As far as I know, again, it's tough to know because there's just such little coverage. There were some rumors in African media that the U.S. was going to engage in talks with Al-Shabaab. And there were some people not happy about it, like senior leaders, but I haven't seen. I tried to see if I could get anybody in the administration, State Department to confirm it, but nobody did that for me. So I don't know.
Clearly,
And
stay not happy.
yeah, they they don't want to talk about that. But I mean, you look at Syria right now. Like the U.S. has embraced this guy Ahmed al-Shara, who actually fought against the U.S. in Iraq and founded the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. So I feel like the argument against negotiating with people, like you could just point to that, and that's what I say to a lot of Iran hawks. They're like, they say death to America. And I like, you see the guy who took over Syria? He joined Al-Qaeda when bin Laden was still the leader right after 9/11. And we're friends with him now.
Inspired him to join Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
He said specifically that the 9/11 attacks are what has inspired him to join Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, so I think that's a good case to point to for people who say, "Oh, you can't negotiate. Can never negotiate with terrorists or any of these groups."
Oh, there's never been a war ended without sitting down and talking to each other.
The devil's advocate answer to that is that al-Shara made a very serious attempt to rebuild his reputation, starting from changing his clothes, overtures to the West, a lot of that backed by the interests of certain states in the Middle East. And even with all that effort, there's still a lot of distrust, even in American circles, whether justified or not justified. I'm a big supporter of engaging with him, but there's still a lot of suspicion. And in Israel, he's completely distrusted, and in some other governments in the EU as well. And so the question becomes, did Al-Shabaab make any similar efforts? It's somewhat unrealistic to expect the U.S. to, especially this administration, to talk to Al-Shabaab without them making these efforts. Even the Taliban made some efforts, in retrospect, very untrustworthy efforts, to show itself to be more moderate before the U.S. talked to it. So is there something like that happening in Somalia?
No, not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any attempt at, Al-Shabaab reaching out or engagement or anything. But again, I'm kind of leaning on people, who consider themselves experts who, again, aren't like me, a guy who works for antiwar.com, or people who are very supportive of a lot of this military action, who make the argument that they're not going to be able to, this is just going to be an ongoing war until somebody decides to call it quits.
Yeah, probably the best argument you could make, I'm sure, I've seen you make it, is that the bombings themselves are radicalizing. That maybe the best thing the U.S. could do would be to engage in sort of benign neglect, because I'm not sure that there's really any avenue for negotiations. Do you think that would be the best avenue, or to perhaps try to encourage the government to make more concessions?
Yeah, I mean, you said benign neglect. I do think that in a lot of these cases, when you have these governments that are propped up by the U.S. or by foreign, and they're kind of reliant on that foreign support, like scaling that back, kind of makes them have to consider other avenues. What is the best way forward? Probably something like that. I would, how should the U.S. handle it right now? I think, stopping the bombing campaign and trying to get them to talk but, I don't know about all the different dynamics, with the government and everything. And, the fact, what I'm trying to do with my coverage of this is to get people talking about it, try to learn more about it. I'm hoping it grabs the attention of journalists with real sources inside the Pentagon and stuff, so we could, get more of a conversation happening about it. Like I said, I think it's just so crazy that this just goes on without anybody being aware of it.
So how damaging have these bombings been? What are we talking about in terms of the consequences that have occurred as a result of the U.S. actions?
Well, again, it's tough to know what's happening on the ground, but Somalia, they're suffering from drought and food shortages. And years ago, there was a horrific famine there, and war always exacerbates that stuff. So you have that aspect of it. There's a hunger crisis. Another thing nobody ever really talks about is the hunger crisis in Somalia. And the airstrikes, again, I don't know. I mean, I don't especially this year. I know in recent years, back in 2019, 2018, there's a few times where journalists got to the scene of U.S. airstrikes and found that, civilians were killed. But we just haven't seen any of that with this year. there was reports a couple weeks ago that there were civilian casualties in a U.S. airstrike against Al-Shabaab. I tried to find more information about it. AFRICOM claimed that they didn't launch a strike that day, so I don't know. That's kind of where the effort ends sometimes because it's just so hard to know what's happening there.
Well,
it'd be like reporting on the Gaza war when all you have is Israel, official what we did,
Yeah, it's similar to that.
Well, that brings an important point. In Gaza, there's a lot of racism in the way we look at coverage in Gaza. People keep saying, why don't they let in journalists? And all that's true. But there's so much good journalism on the ground from Gazans, not just adequate, but just excellent journalism. In some cases, even all cases, much better than the Western journalists. They have more skin in the game. They have more balls. Are we seeing anything similar in Somalia? Is anyone covering anything on the ground there? And if so, how?
Not really that I've seen. I mean, I see some stuff on X sometimes. It's something I got to kind of try to look for more, I think, because I'm sure I could find some stuff. But again, I'm pretty sure, I don't know this for a fact, but this is what they say, that Al-Shabaab, like, they don't allow the use of smartphones and the internet basically in the areas that they control. So the people there, that's a huge disadvantage if you're trying to, get it out there. And you would think, I mean, I don't know, Al-Shabaab doesn't seem to really have any sort of propaganda abilities, because it's just something you never hear about. One thing that was interesting, this is kind of unrelated, but this just kind of popped in my head. About 2 months ago, there was an attack on a U.S. base in southern Somalia launched by Al-Shabaab. And it got, again, no media coverage. Al-Shabaab claimed that they killed Americans, so it got my interest, right away. But then AFRICOM put out a statement that said there was no casualties, and they called it an indirect attack, whatever that means. But I thought what was interesting in the Al-Shabaab statement on it, they cited U.S. support for Israel for what's happening in Gaza, which, I just thought was interesting because, that made me think, talking about what we were discussing earlier, that could be kind of a recruitment tool for Al-Shabaab, is the genocide in Gaza that the U.S. is supporting. Yeah, again, kind of unrelated to what we were just talking about, but that just popped into my head. Because, this is a group, they've been at war with the U.S. for almost 20 years. Like, they don't need new reasons to attack a U.S. base in Somalia. But they mentioned that. I just thought that was interesting.
What about the other end of this? Like, you said that there's parts that are controlled by Al-Shabaab, and then you said there are parts that are held by the U.S. supported Somali government. Is there any media coming out from there?
So not, I haven't seen anything besides, the military will go in and they put on their little press show there. But if you actually look at the map of like who controls what in Somalia, the federal government controls very little territory. And then there are clans that they're allied with, and then some that they're not, and then Al-Shabaab. And then the federal system is like completely broken apart. Like just over this past year, Jubaland in the south, they withdrew from the federal system, and they were actually fighting with the government. Puntland has also withdrawn. They haven't directly fought with the government, but some of the clans on either side have fought. And then you have Somaliland further north, which has essentially been a de facto independent country since the early 90s. And they're just not involved at all, really. They've been relatively stable. So, but no, I haven't. And again, it's something I do need to kind of look. I think I should try to look for more, is the coverage, the stuff from people on the ground, just civilians in whatever controlled part of Somalia that they're in.
What about the neighboring states to Somalia? How much is this spreading to other states? And what is the U.S. doing about that?
Well, there was an attack in, 2020 on a U.S. base in Kenya by Al-Shabaab.
Yeah.
That killed a few, I believe it was 3 Americans, 2 contractors, and 1 soldier. And that's one of those things, I remember that happened and people were like, huh? Like what? Who attacked us? Where? But this stuff, the fighting in this war hasn't really spilled over the border too much, besides, you have neighboring countries involved in the African Union mission. Some of them pulled out recently, like, they've been very frustrated with the Somali government. And they were actually going to end the African Union mission, but then they created a new one and are continuing it for now. But, and we've seen the Al-Shabaab attacks in some of these neighboring countries, but we haven't seen that in a long time. So for the most part, this fighting, lately at least, has been pretty contained within Somalia. And well, we've actually seen some clashes. I forget, again, there's so many factions here. But it was like one of them, I think maybe it was Jubaland, was allied with Kenya and some clashes against the Somali government recently, but those were relatively small. But we've seen a lot of like kind of skirmishes like that.
And what about the role of Ethiopia? They were very involved in the past. I know they've been distracted by other conflicts. What's going on with that now?
Yeah, I mean, again, as far as I know, it seems like they've kind of pulled back a lot. You know, when I see the militaries that are involved right now, it's mostly the U.S. and the main one in the African Union mission is Uganda. They're like kind of the only ones I've seen lately actually having troops on the ground. Ethiopia, I guess, you know, and probably the war there has a lot to do with it, but hasn't been super involved as far as I'm aware in recent years.
What about the role of Uganda? I know that in Congo, they've been very involved in cutting the country up, taking resources. Not that they're alone in that, especially in the past, less in recent years. Are they? What are they doing in Somalia? Are they trying to help stabilize, or are they also following some kind of more nefarious agenda there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, they're part of the African Union mission supporting the government that the U.S. supports. I don't know really much beyond that. Like if they might have something nefarious in mind. You know, I'm not really sure. I do know the UAE is involved in the northern regions in Puntland and Somaliland, you know, and it's in their interest to kind of keep the country broken up. And there's like mineral deals going on that they want. They're very involved the way, you know, in Africa. And I know the clan leader that the U.S. killed in September apparently was very opposed to a lot of what the UAE was doing in the region. But yeah, they have an interest in keeping the country kind of broken apart the way it is. And the reality is that, you know, that's the way things are going to be in Somalia. It's always going to be decentralized. It's just the reality.
Yeah, tell us more about the UAE's role, because right now there's a lot of spotlight on the UAE. For the first time, I've been talking about this for a long time, about what they're doing in Sudan. I was somewhat ignorant of what they were doing in Libya, but I've been catching up on that. So the UAE is playing a role here of destabilizing at least two countries that I'm aware of. Now you're talking about a third. So what's going on with the UAE there?
Yeah, I mean, I know, you know, they've been involved slightly with some of the drone strikes and stuff. I think they've conducted some of their own. I have a friend named Brad Pierce who has a Substack called The Wayward Rabbler. Yeah. And he knows a lot about Africa, like way more than I do. And he recently wrote this whole thing about the UAE's involvement in all these different places. But one thing that he said that was interesting is that there's apparently a weapons pipeline from the UAE to the RSF, and it goes through Somaliland, which the UAE has, you know, again, so Somaliland is like essentially an autonomous region, a de facto independent country. And so I know that they're involved up there with, you know, these minerals deals and backing kind of the secessionist groups. That's about as far as I know about their role there.
Do you know why they're doing it there? They have interests in other countries that are often somewhere between economic and geopolitical.
Yeah, I think it has to do with obviously economic interest, but you know, you look at the map, look where Somalia is, especially Somaliland up there on the Gulf of Aden, across from Yemen. The UAE has been very involved in Yemen. They back a lot of groups there, and they're the ones. I don't know if you guys have seen these reports about airstrips being built on these islands near Yemen. As far as I know, that's the UAE. I think they have some plans for Yemen, and I think the strategic location is part of that.
Yeah, I hate to sound simplistic, but they're just turning into a force for evil in Africa. It's really remarkable. And I think that they have a lot of vulnerabilities because they're trying to be open to tourism and to the international economy. And it's very important to press them on that, in my opinion. I also want to ask, how different is the policy of Trump in Somalia to his predecessors?
That's a good question. So Trump has bombed Somalia like way more than any of the other American president. Like it's almost absurd how much more. And so just to put things in context here. So the U.S. has launched at least 89 airstrikes in Somalia this year. When Biden was in power for 4 years, he launched about 51 air in Somalia in the whole 4 years. So we're up to 89 this year. And then Obama in 8 years launched about 48. And Bush launched, according to the AFRICOM, now I think this number is probably higher because there's reports that the U.S. gave Ethiopia air support when they invaded, and you know those airstrikes weren't tallied. But as far as we know, Bush launched 26 or so. So just to give an idea of how unprecedented this rate of airstrikes is. And also in his first term, Trump set the record for annual airstrikes in Somalia at 63, which he's well beyond that now. And we've seen him do this strategy elsewhere. He did the same thing in Afghanistan when he came in. I mean, I guess Obama did as well, with he surged. Trump, as far as I remember, did he surge troops? He might have sent a few thousand additional troops. He ended up pulling them back, but he surged airstrikes. I mean, he bombed Afghanistan at a very high rate in his first few years in office in the first term. And that's kind of the strategy that we've seen. And now we see it with Hegseth, when they bombed Yemen from March 15th to May 6th, which was a total failure. So they were trying to get the Houthis to stop targeting Israel. They claimed that they were trying to get them to stop targeting American ships, but that's not what it was about. They were not targeting American ships when they started. But anyway, we saw them bomb, just completely unleash the U.S. military in that bombing campaign. And that's kind of been Trump's strategy. And I think the thinking is, we saw him do the same thing against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The thinking is, if we're going to be involved in these wars, no, pussyfooting around, we're going to go in there. And we see Hegseth says this stuff all the time, with the full force, everything we got. So basically, if we're doing it, we're going to be going 100%. And I think that's kind of been the strategy. And this is something Trump did in both of his administrations. He came in, and there was these when Obama came under all this scrutiny for the drone wars, they put on these kind of limits and rules of engagement, extra rules of engagement for drone strikes, creating kind of more oversight. Not really oversight, but they had to be approved by the White House, basically, the drone strikes. So when Trump came in his first term, he got rid of that and basically gave the military commanders free rein to bomb who they wanted. Biden actually tightened those restrictions again, and then Trump came in and loosened it all again, and then we saw that just horrific bombing campaign in Yemen. Another thing a thing I wrote today was Amnesty International said that, the U.S. bombed an African migrant detention facility in Yemen, killed 68 African migrants. And kind of the most egregious part about it is that the Saudis bombed the same facility in 2022, and they were using, targeting data from the U.S. So what is the excuse for that? But anyway, so, this is what, I think we're going to see when they wage war. Trump, this administration, they're going to go all out.
Which me and you were talking about earlier, which is kind of almost a bait and switch thing, kind of from the we're scaling back the wars, we're bringing people home, we're quitting this, and like I said, that's to me the very from both ends, the dystopian side. It seems like there was a little bit of that during Obama too. Where you had, we're gonna pull back, we're gonna do this, and then you had this, hyper escalation of the drone campaign. So I really think that as much as the anti-war folks scream, we got to make sure that we don't scream just because they're talking different. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Yeah, and the things you see them put out, like the peace president, he ended 8 wars. It's just it's just so absurd because first off, a lot of those wars weren't even wars, and they're not ones that the U.S. was involved in. Although I guess now they're counting. Are they trying to count Gaza? Even though we just saw over 100 people get killed there in a night. I mean, it's just it's really frustrating.
Congo that hasn't stopped.
Yeah, and the Armenia-Azerbaijan deal. I mean, that didn't end anything. That's still kind of a brewing, I think, potential conflict. But yeah, it's frustrating. And the thing is, it works on people that don't pay close attention. Well, right now, I don't know if it's working as well as it did in the first term because we did see the war with Iran. That did get a lot of attention. But I bet that there are people who didn't really follow what's going on in Gaza. They hear, there's a ceasefire deal. There's peace. He brought peace to Gaza and aren't even aware of these flare-ups. And I shouldn't even use that term flare-up because what we saw last night was just, absolutely horrific.
100 people a day is, they're going that was the going rate through the war just about, between 75 to 100 people a day. So it's not even a cool down. So it's definitely more than a flare-up.
Yeah. And Vance called it a little skirmish.
Yeah. And we're seeing also the sort of move of some of the similar tactics with those drone strikes now to the, Caribbean used against Venezuela. Can you tell us a little bit about that, sort of how it's moving into different geographic areas, how it's bleeding and becoming sort of the status quo? in managing conflict.
Yeah. So that's getting scary. I mean, that whole thing. So, they started by bombing these boats off the coast of Venezuela. And, we're being lied to in like a bunch of different ways here. They're just throwing like all this stuff at us. So there's been sentiment on the right in this country, the idea of like bombing the cartels. And it's over the outrage of overdose deaths in the U.S., which, like I understand the sentiment. I think it's misguided either way, whether you're actually, but I get like how that can drive people to want to take action. But they've taken that sentiment and they're using it to push a different agenda in the Caribbean, which is Marco Rubio's dream of regime change in Venezuela. And so, I actually think this might be a response to the criticism, because if you look at the numbers from the DEA, from the UN, so fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela, which has caused the most overdose deaths in the U.S. It just simply doesn't come from there. But there is some cocaine that transits through there. It's next to Colombia, but it's a small percentage of the cocaine that makes it to the U.S. that goes through Venezuela and then on a boat or however it gets to the U.S. Most of it goes through the Eastern Pacific from Colombia. They just recently started bombing boats there in the Eastern Pacific. And just the other day, they said they bombed 4 boats in a single day. And I mean, this is like, it's getting really crazy. And these are extrajudicial executions. They're calling them narco-terrorists, but they haven't released any evidence to back up their claims about what these boats are carrying, and zero information about who they're killing. So, it's completely illegal any way you look at it. And the way they're trying to justify it, Trump has told Congress that they're in an open conflict with the cartels. And they say, oh, because drugs kill Americans. And I think we said this earlier, like Trump has claimed, oh, every boat that gets to the U.S., that's 25,000 Americans killed. I mean, it's just such nonsense. And again, this is cocaine mostly that we're talking about. And also the route that they've been targeting from Venezuela to Trinidad and Tobago, some of those shipments could be marijuana shipments. And those boats aren't going to the U.S. This has actually been confirmed by U.S. officials. These are small boats. They're not going to make it from Venezuela to the U.S. They're going mostly to Trinidad and maybe other islands. And then from there, they go somewhere else. And a lot of it can also go to Europe, or even apparently there's a new emerging market for cocaine in West Africa. So we're just being like, they're just lying to us in all these different ways. But it is 2 things, I think: the push toward regime change in Venezuela, and also they are trying to expand the strikes against drug shipments. And I think a big reason why this is happening to Venezuela is because they can do it to Venezuela. Maduro doesn't have any allies in the region. And I think they wanted to kind of set this precedent. For now, they're holding off at bombing targets in Mexico because the Mexican government doesn't want them to. And they have really increased the law enforcement cooperation, this Mexican government, with the U.S. So I guess they're placating them for now. And I think it's like, this is the sentiment among Republican voters as well, not just in the administration, that like, we got this big military, we got drug problems here, let's just bomb it away, which I think, again, this is not like a thing you could bomb away. But
don't they have like a whole fleet of ships out there? Like, wouldn't it just be basically a piece of cake to just grab these guys?
Yeah.
Instead of just bombing them out of the water?
Yeah, they've sent like an armada to the Caribbean. And also now they're sending an aircraft carrier strike group, which that's what they were using to bomb Yemen. So, I mean, that, they have something else in mind here. There's a lot of psychological operations going on too. Like, we've seen all these leaks about the U.S. preparing to bomb Yemen, CIA covert activity. They're trying to scare Maduro into, either fleeing or getting someone in his inner circle to turn on him. But Maduro's
trying to get his pilot.
Yeah, they tried to flip his pilot and get him to land him somewhere. But yeah, Maduro, I mean, he's not going anywhere, I don't think. I mean, considering all the other attempts to try to get him, like his inner circle, I think is pretty secure. And those people are also like under U.S. sanctions and potentially targeted for, under indictment. So like, if they turn on Maduro, the U.S. is probably just going to go after them. And a lot of this is at the Marco Rubio, they're listening to the opposition, the exiled opposition, who's saying, you take him out, smooth sailing from there. Everything's going to go great. We're going to fly in. We'll give you all the oil and everything's going to be great. But, I mean, it is just, the whole thing is really crazy.
It seems like they're kind of believing their own BS at this point, if that makes sense. Because if you think about it, like across And I'm not just using Maduro in this. I would even say what happened in Iran is a good example of this too, where they sent a bunch of stuff to a lot of these Iranian generals saying, flip, or we're going to come after your kids, we're going to come after your, you know what I mean? I think that there's this idea that like everyone in Iran is just waiting to overthrow the government. Everyone in Venezuela is just waiting. They just hate their government. And I'm like, anybody who knows anything about Lockean theory will tell you if that was the case, they would not be the government. So
Well, and generally people
I
don't
just,
like foreign invasions. Like,
yeah,
whatever they think of their own government, like we saw with Iran. I mean, a lot of people kind of, even that were anti-government, regime, kind of rallied around it. Because that was that bombing campaign. I mean, they were killing people in their homes. They were bombing cities. Like what do you think that's going to do to people? I mean, I don't like my government, but if a foreign
yeah,
power
that's
tried to
kind of the point I'm
overthrow
making. Yeah.
it, yeah, like
Well, they greeted as liberators.
yeah, yeah. And Venezuela, I mean, people there, it's been very rough there. But I don't think, the instability, who knows what could happen. You have these armed groups on the border of Colombia and Venezuela in the jungle. They could try to take a piece of the territory. Like it could really break Venezuela up potentially. So yeah, the whole thing. And Maduro's made clear he's willing to work with the U.S. Like, but it seems like they got war on the mind. I'm really hoping that Trump gets steered away from this. But at the same time, it's like it almost feels like there's no turning back now. I mean, they've been flying bombers near the coast like once a week now. Things are really heating up.
One thing that's been very striking about Venezuela for me, as someone who's followed a lot of conflicts, is I've never seen such a lack of buildup in terms of trying to build public opinion, in terms of trying to build a case for war. It does feel like a watershed in that sense, whether it's from understanding that the world has changed or complete incompetence, I can't tell. But usually there's so much effort put into justifying the use of force when it's so high profile. And it's interesting because in Somalia and in Yemen, you can sort of do whatever you want, right? And no one cares. And why that is also interesting. But in Venezuela, you can't. And that lack of any kind of explanation or rationale also is something that seems to be leaking. In a way, we're seeing the Somaliization of American foreign policy in Venezuela.
Yeah. And, one reason why I mean, you could argue that it's bipartisan because Biden essentially left all the sanctions on Venezuela. He eased some oil sanctions like very slightly. And actually that story about a federal agent trying to get Maduro's pilot to land him somewhere where he could be captured was during the Biden administration. But I don't think I think what's happening now with bombing the boats, like I think it is very much the current government, the current regime that's in power in the U.S. Like it's their agenda. So there wasn't really like a big buildup. They're kind of just doing it, like. But at the same time, we did see 60 Minutes just had a whole thing, basically trying to prime the people for this potential war. So, but I think it is a change, and in general, even with the Iran who went on
I think the dam's breaking is what's going on. Like, I really think that or with Israel, Palestine, like a lot of these lies, they're not even good lies. It's to the point where they're just trying to get something out now that's going to get them through the next week because they know it's not going to last. So what's the point in spending all this time to craft this really good lie that's going to fall apart in 2 days on X? You know what I'm saying? So let's put out this lie that's going to fall apart in 2 days on X, and then put out the next one, then put out the next one, then put out the next one, then put out the next one.
Well, I mean,
it seems kind of what they're doing.
That's how they operate domestically too. They have a narrative that's only bought by their base, and sometimes not even by all of their base. When things really fail, like with the Epstein files, and they're okay with that. That's good enough. It's a complete change in politics. It transcends security and foreign policy. And someone who follows Israeli politics very closely, I see the exact same thing there. The government only tries to have narratives that are somewhat palatable to the base, and most Israelis don't buy what the government says about anything. Yeah, now we're seeing this in warfare, and traditionally in warfare, if you don't have sort of an alignment between your military goals and your societal goals, military operations tend to fail quite spectacularly. Vietnam being the most famous example of that, where you had a military operation that worked on a lot of levels, but the politics didn't work out. I think we're going to see a lot of very ineffective warfare from a lot of countries, like what we saw with Israel and Gaza, if you can call it warfare. A lot of slaughter, very little in terms of anything achieved. There's going to be some real security effects for this disconnect. And places like Somalia are a very good example of that. There's absolutely no discourse. There's only bombing. There's only destruction.
Yeah, and Trump actually said in one of his speeches recently, he said, "Oh, no longer are we." He was talking about the use of the U.S. military in foreign policy. He said something like, "No longer are we policing the far reaches of the world like Kenya and Somalia." And it's like, you're bombing the place more than anybody else ever has. Like, it's just so absurd. And one thing that I should have mentioned that I think is really significant is that the head of U.S. Southern Command, the U.S. military command responsible for South America, is stepping down. And according to the reports, he raised issues about bombing these boats and everything in this push toward war with Venezuela. And like, he's a career, 4-star admiral, and he's 1 year into his command. Typically, these commands it's a 3-year post, and then they usually retire after that. But he's kind of abruptly leaving. So I think that goes to show, like, this doesn't have, the military brass, like, they know that what they're doing ain't right here. Like, so yeah, that could definitely affect things.
Do you have any information that him stepping down was related to this?
So nothing, like the New York Times reported, there was a few other reports that said that he raised these issues. It didn't say that it was directly the reason, but it said before he stepped down, he was raising issues and he was clashing with Hegseth. So I'm sure, I think we could probably assume that it was related. No direct evidence, but...
What questions was he raising, do you know?
Didn't really specify. It said that he was raising issues with the military campaign kind of in general, including the strikes on boats. I would guess the legality of it, because he was over the U.S. military commander overseeing it. That's just my guess.
Which would mean he'd be implicated if there was an international law issue, correct?
Yeah. Not that the U.S. ever has to worry about that.
Right.
Yeah, only sort of African states that have regime change need to really worry about international law, it seems.
Well, actually, Duterte.
Yeah, that was good.
He's, being put on trial for extrajudicial executions of drug dealers.
Yeah.
So it's like very similar to what Trump is doing here. And you know what's it's interesting to tie it to Gaza. Do you remember when Trump, I'm sure you guys saw when Trump, when the ceasefire first started and Hamas was kind of reasserting control and they carried out those executions, and then Trump was asked about it and he said, "Oh yeah, they're taking out some very bad guys. These are horrible gangs. They're kind of like Venezuelan gangs." He said that kind of in an offhanded remark. So I think in his mind, he's like, we're kind of doing the same thing. like, when, what was that? When, what was it? Like someone asked him if Putin is evil or has done bad things. And he's like, we've done some pretty bad things too. I think it was kind of a moment like that, like in his brain, where he's like, well, they're they're executing people and we're kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, he divides the world into the powerful and the powerless, and terrorists and drug dealers are sort of the troublemakers among the powerless, and they have no rights and they can just be dispensed with. And that's I think that's one of the reasons that he really sympathizes with what Israel is doing in Gaza, not because he's a huge Zionist, but because, they're terrorist troublemakers. They don't have any rights, like immigrants, like drug dealers, and we see how they're treated by the Trump administration. And that's an increasingly strong trend, I think, that if you're on the wrong side of power, you have absolutely no rights. And Somalia is, again, a great example of that. Once you start extrajudicial killings of people, even if they're bad guys who deserve it, even if there's a national security rationale, once you start extrajudicially assassinating people, it doesn't end there. It goes everywhere. And I think Obama and some of the predecessors have a lot of shares in this.
Oh yeah.
The method is under him. Maybe you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, Obama really started like the kill list, like just drone striking people and killing them, wherever they are and whatever country they're in, just, death from above and that's it. And that's what's scary. Like, so when they labeled the cartels as terrorist groups, my fear was that that's going to justify drone strikes. And that was correct. Even against people that probably aren't even in these cartels and they're just fishermen or whoever, if they are carrying drugs, which I'm sure some of these boats are. I know in at least one case, cocaine, the Dominican Republic said that cocaine washed up or something, but they haven't shown us any evidence. So I don't even want to give credence to their story, but I'm sure some of these boats are carrying drugs. And like, it's not like these guys are like members of the cartel. Like cartels don't work the way that people think they do in their mind, or the way they used to be, where they would you're like a card carrying member of a cartel. Like you're just the guy that gets the thing from point A to point B on this route, and they're just blowing them up and killing them. So, and now we have it in the U.S. They're like declaring Antifa a terrorist organization. So what's the implication there? I mean, are we going to start seeing drone strikes in the U.S.?
Yes. The answer to that is definitely yes. It's just a question of when, in my opinion. Could be not even under Trump. Could be. I can imagine Trump, not being able to with courts, or thinking it's not time yet or whatever. It just feels to me like once you start doing that, it doesn't end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I think you're probably right.
Yeah. The ground is being set to take away the rights of large proportions of the population in the United States, so that anything can be done to them. I'm sure Daniel has some thoughts about that.
I definitely that's kind of always been the game. And I mean, like I said, it's again a model that we see across the world. You see it, like with the whole Israel thing, where it's kind of like both sides of the mouth that, this is our land, but these are not the people that are on it aren't our people. So we can do whatever we want to these people because they're not citizens. They're not part of the in group. As Shael calls it, the in-group, out-group dynamics. You can out-group people. And this is why I say that, and I'm sure you would say as well, the reason why the Constitution should apply to people rather than citizens when we're talking about things like this. It's about being a human being and having rights, not about whether or not a government gave you the rights, if that makes any sense. And so when we don't have our, warrants, we don't have our due process and things like that, it really erodes this situation. And we've been talking about that since the Patriot Act. Libertarians, you can classify somebody a terrorist and then you can kill them like they killed it's getting rid of it just escaped my name. The cleric, his son that was at a cafe. I can't remember.
Yeah, Alawaki. I probably messed up his name, but
yeah.
And well, yeah, and kind of the scary thing about it, because we especially see this in Gaza and like Lebanon. If they consider you a terrorist, it doesn't just mean that they think they can kill you. That means that they believe they have the power to kill you and your whole family. And you saw the U.S. do this in Yemen too, with some of the bombing people. Like the first airstrike was against according to Mike Waltz in that Signal group chat, they hit the Houthis' top missile guy when he walked into an apartment building. And they celebrated it. And in that strike, at least 12 civilians were killed. So, yeah, just not just your life, but your family and the people around you. So yeah, I
want to say his sister was just killed by Trump in his first administration.
Yeah.
Alan, well, I'm going to say his name horribly too.
Yeah, she was killed in January 2017 in Yemen in a ground raid that went horribly wrong, and she was like 11 years old or something. American citizen.
So that's basically all of the family, that's been killed by the U.S. at this point. Through three separate.
And that's bipartisanship right there. Obama killed the daughter, the son, and then Trump killed the daughter.
And they say bipartisanship is dead. Come on.
Yeah.
And think about the implications of labeling Antifa as terrorists, because Antifa doesn't have members, right? You were talking about cartels. This is even more. Cartels, at least you have a product that's being delivered that you can trace. Antifa doesn't really exist. So you can paint anyone as a member of Antifa at any point. It's intentionally elastic to include anyone, I guess, on the left who opposes the Trump administration in any way. And then, of course, anyone nearby is collateral damage. So it's open season on American citizens who are going to oppose the administration. And just today, I saw that they approved the National Guard to have special task forces to put down anyone who, what do they call it, disorder as we're heading into election years. These things are linked. Yeah, everything that we're seeing in Somalia moved to Venezuela, and everything we saw in Venezuela is probably going to end up here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's scary. And people on the right, Trump supporters, they don't think that the Democrats are going to abuse this power. Like, I don't know how they can't see that.
Well, the Trump administration wants to make sure the Democrats are never in power again.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, the only
Well,
way
I mean, until the Patriot Act is used against kids, PTA meetings. I mean, like it just keeps happening back and forth. Like, but I know you said you had to go, around this time. I just really want to say again, we really appreciate you coming in.
Yeah, thanks so much.
If you want
to
go ahead and have a nice last word on Somalia, if you have any idea of any aid ideas, any way that these people are actually being helped,
mm-hmm.
is there any groups or any individuals that you know of?
There's not that I'm aware of. I was trying to figure that out today when you mentioned it earlier, but I don't know any specific aid groups there in Somalia. But, I would just say kind of a lot of the purpose of my coverage and what we do at antiwar.com is to try to just get attention on this stuff. So when it comes to Somalia, like, I just think more people need to be aware of it. Like, we need to discuss it at least. I think the people there owe that at least.
For sure. It's like it can't be empty.
Keep covering it. You're doing the Lord's work. And, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks again. Thanks, guys.
Definitely, man. Anytime, hit us up. We'll have you on because we're always talking about a conflict.
What else are you working on? If I can ask quickly before you have to go.
Yeah, well, a lot of our focus has been on Gaza. I do the news coverage, so obviously we're covering what's happening in Gaza and trying to, the details of the so-called ceasefire deal and everything, and then Venezuela and the push toward the Caribbean. There's other things going on. I mean, I've barely been paying attention to Trump's Asia trip, but for me right now, it seems like the China hawks are kind of losing their steam when it comes to people who want to commit to going to war over Taiwan or something. I think things are settling down a bit over there just because the U.S. empire realizes that they're a little, they're expending too many of their resources to seriously fight China.
Well, yeah, on China, they're becoming more hawkish economically.
Yeah. But I think, and I've even seen from people who are very hawkish on China kind of starting to accept that, yeah, we can't go to war with them. So that's at least good.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm no fan of China, but in their sphere of influence, the U.S. really shouldn't be going to war.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty
because they're not only because it's the wrong thing to do morally, but just they're going to lose.
Yeah, and I think that's such the obvious, sensible position.
Yeah.
But here in the U.S., we have a whole industry, think tank industry. Their whole, they get funded and paid to convince people that war might be a good idea. Yeah. But
the universe is always what destroys the great powers. Pride cometh before the fall.
That's right.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to take off.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
Thanks again. Pleasure. I really appreciate it. It was great meeting you.
Thank you.